Zach with Wingard Wearables. You're one of 12 special people who's going to watch this video to the end. In today's video, we're talking about tomahawks and zombie heads. Now, tomahawks, fantastic tools for, light bushcraft, utility cuts, if you're a hunter, breaking down a deer, that sort of thing. But Halloween is very close, and 'tis the season for zombies. So, Wingard Wearables is pondering, how can you, not only do we provide you the tools for zombie chopping, but how can you test and train against a zombie head? Like, what is the best zombie head to test against? Is it a pumpkin? Is it one of those like ballistics research lab gelatin heads? That sort of thing. So that's what today's video is about. You're going to watch it to the end. It's going to be fantastic and fun. Now, super simple explanation for why tomahawks are so fantastic against zombie heads. You got war clubs, right? War clubs are good against bony targets. You got knives. Knives are good against like soft targets, like knives seek flesh. But the tomahawk combines both attributes of an impact weapon and a cutting weapon. And a zombie, being the undead, its head is going to be, maybe bony, maybe soft and fleshy. So we think tomahawks could be up for the task. Now, since we're concerned about zombies, right, we all know from historic accounts and archaeological evidence, right, that tomahawks were used to chop people in the head, right? So the historic accounts are so numerous with tomahawks being used to hit people in the head that I'm not going to go into it. But the archaeological evidence is actually really scarce. Most of the tomahawk deaths that occurred on the North American frontier, the corpses were just left to rot out in the open, or they were buried in unmarked graves. So it's very rare for modern archaeology to find skeletal evidence of people that met their end with a tomahawk. But there are two historic archaeological finds that we're going to cover. So the first goes back to the French Indian War. The Fort William Henry Massacre. It was sort of the climax of the story in Last of the Mohicans. If you saw the movie in 1992, they had the French General Montcalm conspiring with Magua to set up, basically getting the British and the colonials to surrender to the French, and then afterwards, Magua and his native warriors would ambush them and slaughter them. It was like a treacherous thing. Well, history is a little bit more complicated than that. The Fort William Henry Massacre occurred, kind of the build-up to it, there's a little bit of history background. The French relied heavily on their Native American allies for this campaign, and they wound up recruiting, an estimate of like almost 2,000 Native American warriors, many that came an extremely long distance of travel to get to Fort William Henry, to show up for the fight. And they were recruited, even though they were coming all the way from like, the Mississippi River and Hudson Bay. You've got just all these tribes from a huge area coming in. They were promised by the French, hey, you're going to get, scalps and captives and bounty, plunder, and these warriors risked great difficulty in traveling. If you can think about 18th century travel, it wasn't like they flew to Fort William Henry. It was by canoe, it was by foot, it was pretty treacherous. And when they got there, the French ignored the promises they made to their allies, and they basically gave the British very generous surrender terms, allowing them to leave the fort with all their possessions, even their weapons, just not loaded. And that caused a lot of friction. And so, according to historic accounts, it started with individual warriors killing people that were too sick to move, and also pockets of attacks upon British and colonials, like stripping them of their belongings, and if they resisted, they got killed. So it wasn't like a big, well-planned, sprung ambush like shown in the Last of the Mohicans movie. It occurred over distance and time. And it was still terrible, and the propaganda was used by the British colonials in future conflicts to, firm up the resolve. But that was the history behind Fort William Henry. Now back to the skulls. In 1957, there was an archaeological excavation at the site, and they found graves, and one of them includes a picture from this article here, picture in picture, shows a skull that was described as split by a tomahawk. Now, in the 1950s, this excavation, they did not apply like criminal forensics levels of analysis on like, hey, how big were the tomahawk, wound dimensions, that sort of thing, and how many heads had tomahawk wounds versus others. That was sort of a later thing that you would see in later periods of archaeology where they would really get into detail. But you got Fort William Henry Massacre, a skull split with a tomahawk. Now, there's one other archaeological excavation that showed a lot of tomahawk trauma. And to my knowledge, this is the only other one that's confirmed to have strong evidence that tomahawks were used to kill the individuals that were found. So a bit more history. This is fast forwarding to the Revolutionary War. So the Patriot forces were planning a campaign against Native American tribes that were allied with the British. And their intent was for the Patriot forces to travel up along the Sandusky River. The goal was to get to Detroit, defeat the British there, but none of this worked out. The campaign was a disaster. The Patriots built an outpost called Fort Lawrence in Ohio. It was poorly supplied, and on February 23rd, 1779, there was a work party of 19 Patriots sent out to gather firewood. Well, they got ambushed within sight of the fort, but out of musket range. And so, according to the accounts, there was a volley of musket fire by Native American warriors, and there were some British regulars in there too. Or British Rangers, and then it was immediately followed by warriors rushing in with their tomahawks and some even with war clubs. And 2 of the 19 men in the work party were taken away, but 17 of them were killed on the spot. And there was nothing the men in the fort could do. They stayed in the fort besieged for over a month. They were like starving until a relief force came. The corpses of the dead were just laid out, being eaten by wolves and other scavengers. So when the relief force finally arrived, they buried their remains in a mass grave. And in modern times, that was excavated and examined sort of like criminal forensics. I'm going to do a picture-in-picture here of some of the article that I'm referencing. And I'll try to link to it if the link is still valid in the comment description below. But on the remains, none of the skeletons showed damage from gunshot wounds. So it's not known if that musket volley, just all the projectiles missed, or if the musket balls passed through just the soft tissues, but no skeletal damage showed gunshot wounds. There were over 3 dozen tomahawk wounds on 17 skeletons. Almost all of these were inflicted on the head, on the skull. And I think, if I remember the article correctly, there was only one chop that wasn't to the skull. It was to the hip of one of the hip bone of one of the skeletons. But there was also an absence of spike strikes on the tomahawks. So spike tomahawks, similar to something like this, like our stingray tomahawk, were very popular weapons and tools on the frontier. And so the warriors, armed with tomahawks, and some of them would certainly be spike tomahawks, did not use the spikes for percussive impact into the opponent's skull. And so there's probably, my theory is that they didn't need it. Like the axe chopping blades were so concentrated, they did fine as effective incapacitation. My theory on the spike tomahawk is the spike side is used when you can't get the chop in. You use that to tear down or meat hook into an opponent to bring them to ground. And such an injury, if you were doing sort of a meat hook type effect with the spike, that would be a soft tissue injury that wouldn't show up on the bones. So, back to the skulls. So the skulls showed that most of the chops, there's a variety of chopping edges, right, that hit the skulls. But some of the blades were wider and didn't bury into the skull. They did inflict damage, though, and you could also imagine there'd be a concussive effect. But some of the chopping blades buried deeply. Like one of them was a 1 3/16 inch wide chopping blade, so slightly narrower than this back ripper tomahawk chopping blade. And it went through the base of the skull, which is the thickest part, and actually caused an additional cut inside the skull cap. So it just buried so deep through the back of the head that it hit further into the top of the head. That's like incredibly concentrated. But out of all the tomahawk blades that were hitting these skulls, the average size was just 1 7/8 inches. Like these chopping blades were really narrow. And a lot of the tomahawks, I think, because they were so light, you would do better on a zombie head if you had a more concentrated chopping blade. Another way to do that, if you have a wider chopping blade, is to make it very curved, right? So that has sort of a concentration on edge impact. Or to go like a spontoon tomahawk like this. And speaking of spontoons, if you go back to our video on Moses Van Campen and his escape, that's another rare example of where we have a specific tomahawk that was used in a violent encounter, like verified to have been used against people successfully. And that tomahawk is up in display in a museum, and it's a spontoon tomahawk. So spontoon tomahawks and other concentrated chopping blade tomahawks are going to work on a zombie head. Okay, let's say you have one of our tomahawks or another tomahawk brand, and you want to understand how much distance force and extraction force is required to chop and bury and extract a tomahawk against a zombie head. Well, you're going to need something that simulates a zombie head. What is the best way to do that? Now, a little bit on my background. I've worked for years on weapons, day job ballistic rate weapons, so much faster than tomahawks. You know, a tomahawk is impacting at tens of feet a second. Ballistic weapons are hundreds of feet a second to thousands of feet a second. And I've gotten my hands on some of the methods that professionals have used to evaluate ballistic injuries. Gel blocks. Gel blocks simulate muscle tissues, right? The soft fleshy bits. Human heads are not well represented by a gel block. A gel block is representing just a block of muscle mass. The skull is a structure, and there's other things inside it. It's much more complicated than just a block of gelatin. I've also seen human heads represented by just lumps of clay, like they put a helmet on something and look at back face deformation. But they aren't really concerned with like the penetrative injury into the skull. You know, the clay is just determining how much back face deformation occurs, like blunt impact trauma. And the other I've seen is like highly instrumented, like with accelerometers and force transducers, something the shape of a human head. And again, that's looking at like G loads and, you know, pressures on skulls. It's more blunt impact and not penetrative trauma. And I think kind of the assumption is if you have a penetrative trauma event on a skull, the person's pretty screwed anyway. But none of these are looking at penetration into a skull. I am not aware of any professional research organization that uses the gelatin, fake skull, zombie heads, pig heads, coconuts, or fruits to directly simulate a penetrative event on a human head. So for our zombie head research, what are we going to use? And I wondered, you know, hey, what do professionals use to actually simulate like penetration into the head back when they cared about it? Well, in the 1940s to 1970s, and this gets kind of gross, but hey, this is a Halloween-themed video, ballistic labs used to use cadaver heads. Sometimes they would use something they called greased skulls. It was like you'd had a skull, you'd grease it down so the bone wouldn't get dry, and then you'd put gelatin in it, but cadaver heads were more common. And they were used from the 1940s to the 1970s, and they were at least available to order into the 2000s. I think during the war in Iraq there was some work on like counter IED stuff, so there may have been like some cadaver head stuff on order. But I remember someone telling me that a cadaver head cost $800 a pop. And that was back in 2010. Like think of $24. So $800 a pop for a cadaver head. That is like very expensive. And when you think of like simulating a zombie head, right, you can't get more anatomically accurate than a dead person's head, right? But it's like disgusting, immoral, and very expensive. And when I'm looking at like, hey, how do you as a Wingard Wearables watcher of YouTube videos pick out your most practical zombie head? It's like, hey, if If you're simulating a zombie head to chop against, it's got to be affordable, it's got to be reasonably realistic, but it's also got to be fun to use. And using a cadaver head seems impractically expensive, immoral, and apparently a lot of the cadaver heads were like people who donated their body to science. So if your grandma was like, hey, just donate my remains to these scientists, well, apparently there's some cadaver head salesman who's just marketing grandma heads out there for just terrible things. So we're not going to have that on our channel. It also just seems biologically risky, and like if you tested a cadaver head, what would you do with it afterwards? I'm pretty sure if you tried to dispose of it, you would just go to jail, right? So, impractical. Now, what is more procurable? Skulls and gelatin. These sort of skulls filled with colored goo. They are all over YouTube videos. And so we went out to purchase one of these ballistic dummy lab skull heads to see how it would go. Pig heads. Now, pig heads as a Tomahawks zombie skull surrogate are kind of problematic. First, they're difficult to source. Second, they're when they come to market of this size, they're usually much thicker than a person or a zombie head. So they've done medical studies where they looked at scalp mechanical properties and skull thicknesses of pigs at various weights, and you need a smaller pig to represent a zombie head, but we just didn't know how to source one close enough. So this is the size of pig head we got. Pretty sure the skull thickness is substantially greater than a person. Scalp thickness is better too. So we're going to try hitting it with the back ripper, our most concentrated chopping blade. Couple of places along it. First, we're going to target this cheek area as just skin and flesh and fat to look at the extraction. And then we're going to hit the bony areas, potentially even the back of the head region, which this should be the thickest part of the skull. Now, our customers have hit pig heads with their Winger Wearables Tomahawks, but the pigs were smaller. Either they were like feral hogs of smaller size than this, or they were, able to source smaller size pig heads. But we're going to see how this goes. And I think the most problematic thing is, you see, I am wearing gloves. I'm about to be wearing a face shield because this has been frozen when we purchased it. It's now been thawing in a bucket in our driveway for a couple of days. You don't want biologically questionable back spatter on you, right? So you kind of got to glove up and at least wear eye protection, preferably mouth protection. So yeah, that's the problem with using any animal-based biological target. There is a risk of disease. The things I do for views.
That's terrible.
All right. we have an opportunity here to hit a huge pig tongue, right? Because your zombie could have like a giant, ridiculous tongue as it's trying to like eat your brains. And we got a really big, thick pork jawbone here. So we're going to try a crack at that. We're just hitting bone, aren't we?
You're just missing it.
Okay. Ready? Woo! That went in. Come on, piggy. It is in there. It's really in there.
It did go through.
It did go through.
Okay, I'm gonna stop these.
Can't get it out. It's like hooked in there. There we go. Snug as a bug. It buried through. We're not doing that again.
Okay.
There we go.
That's how you get it out.
All right, let's try that again.
So much for that.
Are you ready? Okay, that berry's in there. All right, that buried in there. All right, we're gonna try to catch us a pig ear because you might be up against one of those Hollywood zombies that just has really exaggerated features. It just cuts right through. All right, here we go. That looks pretty neat. There you go, the ripper. So there you go, the back ripper. Hook, meat hook on the stick. Sharpen, propagates the cut. I love pumpkins. Pumpkins might be my favorite tomahawk target. So I'm coming at this with a little bit of bias, okay? When I see a pumpkin, I think of fall. I think of childhood memories, you know, trick-or-treating and candy and stuff. You having my parents sort through my candy and my dad taxing us a significant portion of candy, you learn a lot of life lessons with that. But back to pumpkins. Pumpkins are great, and very biased opinion here, but you can use them for pumpkin seeds or a jack-o'-lantern. So when you're done clobbering one part of the pumpkin with your tomahawk, you can then use it for other things, right? I think the price of pumpkins is what, $9 a pumpkin now and $24? It's pretty absurd. But in theory, you could grow your own pumpkin, right? So that's another advantage to the pumpkin. And here's the other that I'm going to hopefully not be proven wrong on. Backspatter. I've chopped into a lot of melons and cantaloupes and flesh and bone type targets, and I've had customers hit live flesh and bone targets, and materials that are soft and juicy when the tomahawk hits into them create backspatter. Now, a pumpkin has fluid in it, but it is not like a wet, pulpy thing, unless it was like a really rotten, waterlogged pumpkin. I've had customers bury their tomahawks into a pig head that they had freshly killed, and the blood backspattered into their mouth. That's like how you create a new disease, right? So later, you gotta wear like a face shield and that sort of thing if you're hitting like flesh and bone targets. Pumpkins, you're not worried about some biological hazard, and they aren't like fluid filled, so you don't do the wussy like face squint thing that I do when I hit a melon or a cantaloupe, because I don't like the backspatter. So pumpkins usually don't have backspatter. I think I've talked enough about that topic, but there's something else to talk about with pumpkins. I'm going to grab my notes. Pumpkins are the only target I'm aware of as a surrogate human head that was historically used. And I'm going to read from an account. This is from History of the Settlement of Steuben County, New York, including the notices of old pioneer settlers and their adventures, published in 1853. Quote, sometimes the Indians treated the settlers to a display of their tactics, hiding behind a rampart of roots or lying in ambush among the bushes. At a signal given, the whole party fired their rifles at certain imaginary foes. The chief sprang up and raised a war whoop, and then the 300 joined in that frightful cry of the Six Nations, which, to use the phrase of the pioneers, quote, was enough to take the hair off a man's head. Then, rushing out, they tomahawked the pumpkins and scalped the turnips, then dodged back to their covert and lay still as snakes. Now, Iroquois, who had lots of experience burying tomahawks into people's heads, were using pumpkins to demonstrate their prowess. Now, that could be that they weren't growing watermelons, right? The Iroquois were growing pumpkins as one of the food crops, right? Maybe this was just the closest thing they had that conveniently worked for them. But I think that might be good enough for me. So we're going to test, and we're going to know, when you got pumpkin, how much chop and extraction force you need. Now, a pumpkin usually exaggerates extraction forces, which is kind of good. You want to kind of have a little exaggeration to it so you make sure you get reliable extraction. But that's what's good about pumpkins. It sort of simulates a harder, soft target, and it exaggerates that extraction force, which I think is good for training. All right, we got the back ripper, and we're going to bury this into the pumpkin and see how easily we can extract it. All right, full length. Not easy to extract out of a pumpkin, right? So that's a lot less ideal compared to a soft flesh and bone surrogate. And we got the sparrowhawk. We're going to do a chop and extract, right? Woo, that flew by. No back spatter though, just a chunk flew at me. And one of the great things about having, a surrogate target is you can test how close and confined space you can be to get some sort of piercing or chopping effect. Like if you're really close up, can you use pommel strikes and that sort of thing? Like how much space do you need, right? So yeah, you have all sorts of options on how you can use your pumpkin for training purposes. What about coconuts? Now, I have tested coconuts and even coconuts wrapped in thin meat to simulate a skull with like a layer of scalp on it. I have found coconuts to be way too variable. When you go to the grocery store, it varies, but around here, the grocery stores would typically pre-score like score marks onto the coconut. The coconut diameter is way smaller than a human head, so you're impacting at like a smaller, more concentrated area, and they're brittle usually when they're from the grocery store. Like they'll shatter kind of like a pot, like a jar. So I haven't really found them to be useful from the grocery stores around here. And I've gone to tropical environments where there are coconuts out in the wild, and those are way too variable. Like you'll get some that have like all the husk on them, and it's like literally this thick to get through to the core of the coconut that you usually get at the grocery store. I've even had some that were like, so that's off the charts thick, but I've had others that were like off the charts weak. Like I remember a few times I just, I had my Empress and my swimming trunks. I'm walking on the beach, hey, there's a coconut, and I would chop into the coconut, and not only would the spontoon blade split through the coconut, but so would the handle with just no effort at all. It was like hitting air. So coconuts, through all their development cycles and stuff, they're just completely variable in mechanical property. So I am not a fan of coconuts. Total crapshoot. But, the advantage of coconuts, there is no risk of like disease. It's not like testing the pig head. And they're a lot cheaper than the zombie heads. Still, thumbs down for me. Not a fan. Now, other fruit type targets, melons, like cantaloupes, honeydews, watermelons, not problematic at all. Easy to process afterwards so you can actually eat the target material. I find them to be reasonably affordable. I know that sometimes they go out of season in the grocery store, but they're reasonably affordable and fun target media that simulates some of the realities of soft target penetration and extraction.